Thomas, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
We like to start off by going maybe a bit off from the finance road, but in your career, from what you've seen, what abilities have stood out that bring a joyful or a growth, like exponential growth career?
It's a great question. I've been lucky enough to work for some people that have been very successful, and I'm guessing they would all admit that luck. It's probably better to be lucky than skillful. But they had great skills, and I think that can stack the deck to help you to some degree, and it gives you more time. So I worked with and for Joe Mansueto, who started Morningstar, and he's of course been extremely successful. He had a great idea, and passion to pursue that. And then I also was lucky enough to work for Roger Ibbotson, kind of a luminary in the world of economic finance. I think both of these guys extremely smart and bright and driven and passionate about what they're doing. Maybe stepping back from these truly successful people, the people that I see that can kind of move the needle in kind of, I'll say, a larger organization like I work are people that have kind of a well-rounded set of skills. So it seems to me, as we've moved towards specialization, the specialists, I think, struggle at some level to kind of see the big picture, to be able to communicate, let's say, with clients, to know investing, to know tech. It's hard to know all of those things, but the people that can see all of those items and kind of excel at all of them, and that's a hard skill to have, right? To be great at multiple disciplines, but the people that are the ones that can really get things done and improve things. So
It sounds to me like Range, like the book from Mr. Epstein, I think it was. But you mentioned in the end, with the tools that we have now, especially I imagine every time you get called for an interview, someone asks about AI in the robo advisor world.
Well, they probably
How do you see the
should.
impact? Yeah, I
Well,
think it's important. Yeah.
I don't have a clear vision for how it's going to play out again, and I'm sure there's people that think they do. I think it's going to be a profound impact, not just on finance, but in a broad number of areas. The ability to go to your device, whatever device that might be, again, your phone, your tablet, your computer, or maybe some other device that I'm not even thinking of, and receive kind of immediate, personalized answers to whatever questions you have. Again, this could be in finance or somewhere else. My belief is that we're entering a new era in which that will be amazingly powerful. Again, I'm unfortunately older, and when it seemed as if we didn't really have access to computers when I was, like, say, a child. Was when, as I grew up, that computer access came along, and then internet search, as an example. It was pretty iffy, to find something that answered the question that you had. And of course, with Google search, that's become much better to be able to find answers, but it still takes time, right? And even like if you were looking for a specific advice related to any particular topic, the search results may be iffy when you get back. And now if you think about kind of AI and searching via AI and asking questions of AI, the answers are often excellent. And again, I think people point out right now that sometimes the answers are wrong, or the AI is perhaps hallucinating. I think that's just a small blip on the journey that we're on. And if you think the rate of improvement here in this technology is so incredible. Again, I think it's going to have a profound impact on kind of our lives in general. And then as it relates to kind of financial planning, financial advice, again, that too, a dramatic impact. Again, if you're a financial advisor or planner, I think these people are asking the question of, I think the usual question is that going to replace financial planners and advisors?
Hmm.
Well, I think it's going to change the activities that the advisors do. And in my own life, 25 years ago, financial advisors and financial planners that would work with individuals, they frequently thought of themselves as the investment expert or guru, and they would be trying to apply things like optimization, modern portfolio theory, build the portfolios. And now there's some advisors that still do that, but I think that most of them have looked, you know, kind of gone down an outsourcing, route where they're using other experts, the home office, the dealer group to provide some of that heavy lifting. And they see their expertise more around the communication, the coaching of their client. And, so I think they've naturally gravitated towards maybe what they have a unique skill at and let those that are, experts in some other area. And those experts could become, people that are leveraging AI, using AI enabled tools to create the advice. Again, but I think it shifts the role of the advisor. And there'll, of course, be some advisors that become extremely powerful in terms of scaling their business, communicating to their clients in a very scalable way because they are early adopters and excellent at leveraging AI. I think the difference between, say, like a good advisor and a bad advisor, that's probably going to grow as a result of some people being just up to speed on what is the latest tech and leveraging it in a powerful way, and others kind of just getting left behind.
You talk about passion, and I feel a lot of passion when you talk about these things, AI, financial planning, etc. Why do you feel so passionate about that?
I wish I had a noble answer to that. Like, I really want to help people, and I do want to help people. But when I was probably in my 20s, I became more and more interested in finance, and I started reading books on finance, and I loved it. And I know a lot of people, they work because they have to, um, and I too work because I have to. But I really love what I get to do, and I'm probably in a unique role where you, most of the people who are doing the types of research that I get to do are probably academics, and and of course I'm not an academic, but I somewhat get to pursue a research agenda that is equivalent to what an academic might get to pursue, and then I have the added benefit of the technology, the systems, the research that we do. We get to apply it in the real world, and actually, an academic wants their theories to get used and adopted. I want my theories to get used and adopted, and I want our methods to actually be applied to help people have better outcomes. And so, again, I would like to have a noble answer, like I really want to help these people, and I do. But again, I think you're right. I am passionate about kind of the science of what we're doing and trying to advance that science.
You mentioned the modern portfolio theory, portfolio optimization. I think that's kind of the status of the industry in Chile now. People answer a risk questionnaire. They are qualified as either risky or conservative, and they have a portfolio. And I think that's it. And what we're trying to do with Francisco is go beyond that and implement comprehensive financial planning, which is really not present in Chile right now. And you oversee probably the largest robo advisor that is not only recommending funds. So I'm really curious, what kinds of things can software do for a person that goes beyond just saying on what you should invest in?
Well, I'm going to back up, I guess. So you mentioned modern portfolio theory. Within the world of financial economics, I think there's two giant theories where there's been a huge number of kind of Nobel Prize winners did work in kind of what's something called life cycle finance. So there's life cycle finance and modern portfolio theory. And modern portfolio theory is really the work Harry Markowitz. And to me, that really caught on, right? So Harry Markowitz, wrote his article in 1952. His book comes out in 1959. And then as kind of computing power, let's say, increased, and desktop-oriented tools were developed for financial advisors, the power of modern portfolio theory, aka mean variance optimization, was kind of placed on their desktops, and they were able to do that. Concurrently, 75-ish years ago, Franco Modigliani, Paul Samuelson, others were doing work on, the life cycle hypothesis or life cycle, finance. And today, I think economists would frequently refer to kind of life cycle finance as this is the model or method that an economist would use to construct a financial plan. And again, you were kind of speaking about kind of the state of practice within Chile. I think that's global, that the vast majority of financial planners, financial advisors are essentially unaware of life cycle finance. And life cycle finance helps you answer what I think are the more meaningful, more big picture questions about how do you, consume and save throughout your lifetime so that you can, actually spread your consumption. So for most of us, we work, during our younger years, and at some point in time, we retire. Yet after retire, we would like to continue to consume in a manner that was relatively consistent with what we consumed, prior to retiring. We face, a giant risk. One of the things that we like to talk about is kind of your economic balance sheet. On the asset side of your balance sheet, consists of, two big items. The one item that everybody knows about and is applying modern portfolio theory to is somebody's financial assets, their financial capital. But all of us have a hidden asset. We don't get a report that tells us the value of it, but we have human capital. We work throughout our lives, and that produces cash flows that we use to pay for ongoing consumption, and we save some portion of that that paycheck, and eventually that's going to pay for consumption in retirement. So, from a software tool perspective, there's a lot to unpack in your question. What we're trying to do is, I'd say, lead with what I would say is kind of financial planning light, based on the concepts of life cycle finance and how one's total economic balance sheet evolves, helping them to make sure that they're saving enough to try to produce relatively smooth consumption throughout their lifetime. Young people, again, going back to human capital, if you're, a young, say, physician, might have a lot of debt, from going to medical school. And maybe you've had some children, and you have lots of human capital, and you haven't been able to save much at this point. And your family is very dependent on the idea that you're going to be able to work for the next 40 years, producing a steady income. Well, you can protect the unrealized value of that human capital through, purchasing life insurance. If you contrast that to somebody who's, say, financially wealthy, does not have a lot of, human capital, does not have, children that are dependent upon their income, it's not important for them maybe to protect their human capital because they don't need to. Once in retirement, something that, life cycle finance addresses is, we don't know when we're going to die. A lot of, depending upon which country you live in, life expectancy might be in the high 70s, could be maybe even the upper 80s. In Japan, I think, people live quite a while. But that's kind of the median or average of when people will make it to. But some people, the number of centurions, as an example, people that make it to 100, that's growing all the time. And, do I need enough money at retirement if I'm retiring at, say, 65? I might retire at 60, I might retire at 70. But how long is retirement going to last? Do I need enough money to last 15 years, 20 years, maybe 50 years? You don't know. And the amount of money you need, changes depending upon how long you're going to live. And, so there are, of course, insurance oriented products, annuities that one can purchase and have income for life. And again, you might get hit by a bus the next day and you've lost the value of that because, some people that retire die right away. But that money is what enables the person that makes it to 108 to still have an income. And so, again, software systems, in my opinion, they need to think about the big picture, the financial planning, and then almost a secondary concern, the one we spend all our time on, is how do we actually invest the assets?
You can make this plan, taking in account your assets, your liabilities, etc. We know that our podcast is called Financial Animals because we're more irrational that we think maybe. So, what is the role of the financial planner in order to help you to go through this plan, to don't expend more that you earn, and to live your life in a way that you can finance when you're older?
Yeah, right. Some of us are our own worst enemy. And, I, as a chief investment officer, CIO, overseeing systems that systematically manage money, I don't have, let's say, the luxury or the privilege of often meeting directly with a client whose money that we're managing. But I try to speak to financial planners, financial advisors, and the impression I get is the best advisors end up really getting to know their clients in a profound way. They're more than just their advisor. They're a family friend at some level. Um, and they begin to understand like who are the clients that are more susceptible, right, to panicking when the markets are down, to perhaps overspending, etc. And that's when they need to proactively, by understanding their client, try to um, create an environment where they'll be able to help protect that investor when it's needed. And so, like, an example of this might be is that often, roughly 2/3 of the time, seemingly, stocks are kind of outperforming bonds. I don't know if that'll continue, but that's kind of the life that many of us have lived. And, what our kind of data and analyses show is that it's, about once every 7 years, and it could be more frequent, it could be less frequent, the market sells off in a material way, where, 20% or more. And that's frequently when people begin to panic. And my understanding is that, the best advisors frequently try to, have that conversation with their clients around, let me illustrate to you what is possible. You've invested in an aggressive portfolio or a moderately aggressive or whatever it happens to be. And we can create, a picture of what that might look like during the COVID crisis, during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, during the dot-com bubble. You could paint kind of a picture of how bad it can be, and then discuss kind of what happened afterwards. It frequently, the markets have bounced back, and I think by trying to educate your client about the idea, remember we talked about this, we knew this type of event could occur, and that means it's not the time to take 100% of your portfolio and move to the money market fund, to cash. We're going to stay the course often. And if you've had those conversations up front, you've understood the psychological weaknesses to some degree of your clients, hopefully when you need them to listen to you, they will.
That hurts because I was talking to a client last week we were supposed to have a regular meeting. He skipped it, and when we talked, he said, "Yeah, I sold all my aggressive portfolio, and now I'm in cash, and I'm ready to come back." And I was like, "Okay, I failed as a advisor."
Right. And that's it's a common story that, again, I think we all forget about what is our true tolerance for risk during an up market. And again, kind of that FOMO, that fear of missing out or seeing what other people have their portfolio and it looks like it's doing so well. And we just start kind of putting more and more risk on. And then, the bottom falls out. And what happens is people frequently move, like you say, all to cash. And then they're either they're scared on the sidelines forever. And so they become, such a conservative investor that they're not going to participate kind of in the overall growth of the economy and stock market. And then there's just another group that, they thought they could time that. I'll get back in once things look a little bit more calm. Well, the market, these upswings typically happen in a day. In bam, the market has kind of recovered significantly within days. And if you weren't lucky, it's really luck to be able to time that reversal. You lost out.
No one has been able to time the market, and we keep repeating it, but people keep forgetting. So
Right.
I just wanted to go back a bit, and it's related maybe to this, how much risk you should take, related to human capital, because in your book, which we will link in the description,
Look
and
at all
it's
those
a free
notes
book
too. Yes, free.
Yeah, it's not because you're here, but I told Francisco when I read it that it might become like our Bible on how to build our business. So
Well,
in the book, you mentioned a lot about, or what blew my mind really is, human capital can be modeled as a financial asset. Okay, that makes sense because you will have the cash flows. But then that should affect how you invest your financial capital. Because if your human capital is like a bond and you want to invest in 50% equities, you shouldn't invest 50% equities of your financial capital. You maybe should invest 100% equities because you have your bond allocation with your human capital. And that's like a very interesting thing. And I don't know, have you rationalized it, how customers or your users usually take it? Does it make sense for them as well? What has been like your path here?
Right. I think some people, it's extremely intuitive. It makes a lot of sense to them. And for others, I think they wrestle with it again because we don't get, a monthly statement that reports the value of your human capital. But and it's easier when you're talking with, say, financial professionals who are, so valuation, right, is a key thing in finance. And what is the appropriate value for like a capital expenditure, say a machine or a business, and all of that ends up frequently being, I'll call it a spreadsheet oriented exercise, where in finance what we learn is you try to estimate what are all the expected cash flows of a given thing. That could be the business, a machine, or in our case, a person. What are the expected annual cash flows that are stemming from my job? And then I need to discount those to turn it into a net present value. One comes up, you discount that at appropriate discount rate that reflects the riskiness of the expected cash flows. And of course, different people in different careers have different levels of risk associated with those cash flows. And again, I guess I don't quite know how it works in Chile, but in the United States, if you're, say, a government employee, a postal worker, a teacher, and sometimes a university professor for the state university, the government university. No matter what's happening in the economy, in the stock market could be plummeting. The paychecks for all of those careers are extremely steady. These people are rarely, fired. They're not let go. They're not correlated. Their income is not correlated in any way, shape, or form with the market. And so they have what we think of as being, very safe or bond-like, human capital. And thus we would model it as being mostly, not all, but mostly like a giant bond that is throwing off steady income. And then you have people that might be, a stock broker or, some sort of commission-based salesperson, an investment banker. There's a number of careers that have much more, they might be a higher on average salary, but they're also year in and year out, much more volatile. And as such, from a human capital perspective, that is a type of human capital that for some people might actually be more stock-like than bond-like. Again, for the vast majority of us, it's some combination of the two, probably more bond-like. And then, of course, again, as I just mentioned, there are careers where it's very safe human capital. And if you have that safe human capital, it gives you the ability to take on more risk with your financial capital.
When you talk about teachers and those kind of professions and the situation here in Chile, I think that there are a lot of people that works for the government and they have a really steady income. The problem is the level of that income.
Right.
So I always try to tell my friends, my family that I don't want to depend on the state to finance my last years. So when you have a problem in the level of your salary, maybe you're more pushed on to take more risk. Can you talk about tolerance, about risk, and the risk that you need to take in order to accomplish, to optimize your life consumption?
If you have a career that has, say, a low income, again, part of that's you can't escape that, right? Or what could you do? You could go back to school and try to get a new, become an expert maybe in AI or something else. and maybe, and then you could stop being a teacher if you didn't like that for whatever reason, and you could go into a profession that had a higher level of income, but it might be more volatile. And so some of that is, some people love being a teacher. My sister's a teacher; it's a great job. Um, maybe the level of income isn't what she would like it to be, but that's kind of that's the situation she's in. When it comes to kind of thinking about allocating your assets, most of us, again, aren't willing to go change the fundamental nature of our human capital. So we kind of have to accept it for what it is. In my sister's case, so she went on, and, she got her, undergraduate degree, then her graduate degree, and then different certifications. And each time she went, kind of invested in her human capital, she was able to, in the United States, kind of move up in terms of what she's paid because she has higher qualifications. And so there was a way for her to boost, let's say, her human capital. But now if we go back to just kind of the investment question, you bring up risk tolerance, and I'm going to add in another word, risk capacity, and I'm going to try to define those a little bit more precisely because I think there's different people define these in different ways. Paul Samuelson, and one of the Nobel Prize winners, one of those associated, deeply with life cycle finance. In economics, I think the definition of risk tolerance is really about just about attitude. What is your attitude towards risk taking? And I separate out, what is your capacity or ability to take on risk? And it's those two things working together that ultimately determine how much risk you should be taking on, let's say, with the part that you control, which is how aggressively do you invest your financial capital. And so if we kind of, play this out, and, we might have an investment banker, they have very volatile cash flows, and maybe we've ultimately decided that the nature of their cash flow series is maybe 50% stocks, 50% bonds. And so we would have a pretty high discount rate that we would apply to their future cash flows. But that number still might be a bigger asset than, say, a teacher would have with a 10% equity, 90% bond, kind of weighted average cost of capital for discounting those cash flows. But then when we, craft the asset side of the balance sheet, we would note that, that investment banker has a giant allocation to stocks and to bonds resulting from their human capital. That teacher would have, an allocation of 10% of their human capital value, whatever that number happens to be, would be thought of as stocks, but 90% would be thought of as bonds. And when it comes to allocating the financial capital, chances are, just as I think was kind of, inherent in your question, the teacher actually should be taking on more risk with their financial capital because they already have this safe, wonderful asset in the form of their human capital. The investment banker, with their riskier human capital, they should arguably be taking on less risk with their financial capital than the teacher. Now, their attitudes might be different, but assuming the same attitude, the teacher's safe human capital allows her to invest, or them to invest more aggressively with their financial capital.
Do you think that that attitude can change if you have more financial education? Because maybe that teacher knows way less than that
Right.
banker, but she needs to take
Yeah.
more risk. And she needs to support the volatility of the stocks.
Sure. There's studies kind of on this and to what degree do people's attitudes change. So, and they find a lot of things. I think big picture, a lot of people's kind of root attitudes as to, how comfortable are they with risk. I think it's, for many people, relatively steady throughout their lives. I think there's another group of people who experience something, and it could be through education or just kind of, life circumstances that alter kind of their attitude towards risk. And like, I think an example might be, the young bachelor who, somebody's 25, they're having a good time, there's, nobody really in their life. They might be really okay with risk. And then once one gets, married, has some children, maybe experiences some scary moments, it's unclear. But I think people can change their attitude. And of course, I think you brought up in your question, through education, could that evolve one's attitude towards risk? And I think so. I think, for a number of people that are probably seeking professional advice from an advisor, right? They don't really understand, the stock market's a mystery, right? And they don't understand kind of what can happen and why might they lose money, and maybe the difference between, say, a concentrated investment versus an extremely diversified investment. And again, going back to kind of the value that an advisor and a planner can bring in the real world, it's about, often about educating one's client. And I think that through that education, it might, mean that they're willing to take on more risk. I think that one attitude is I don't want any risk at all. I don't want to lose anything. And of course, that's probably not a rational or prudent way to move forward. Again, if you really want to grow wealth over time, some amount of risk taking is usually necessary.
I think it is. Yeah. I was doing like a mental tracking of what we went over because we talked about human capital, which for me it's like a huge way of think differently about the markets and investing and financial planning. Then about risk profiling that people usually don't do well, and this like adaptation and everything is an important part of having a correct risk profile. And then I was thinking the other part that I would like to bring into a good financial plan is discovering people's objectives. How do you include like maybe the classical path that someone might take, start a family, buy a house, retire, of course, at some point? And how can you discover what really moves maybe a person. There's an exercise by Morningstar that is called Discovering Financial Goals that I've been using a lot, and it's been pretty useful. But I don't know if there are other things that you've discovered that are pretty interesting.
Um, yeah, I don't know that so I think there's like, some gamification that goes into kind of some risk profiling, revealed risk preference. So can you set up things that seem very real and let's see how people kind of react? I think an element of your, uh, as a bit of a story, so my history was I worked for Ibbotson Associates, again, Roger Ibbotson's firm, and then Morningstar ends up buying Ibbotson Associates in, like, I think it was '06. But Ibbotson, Roger was at Yale, and before that had been at the University of Chicago. So very academic minded firm. And, Ibbotson Associates had hired Dick Thaler and Danny Kahneman to, work on what was the Ibbotson risk tolerance questionnaire. And I guess I would argue that kind of Ibbotson Associates helped, I don't know, popularize globally the use of kind of a risk tolerance questionnaire with the help of, Dick and Danny, working on this questionnaire. But I personally didn't get to work with Dick or Danny. I wish I had, but people had described, kind of how they thought, Dick and Danny, what did they really think about this risk tolerance questionnaire system that they'd worked on? And I think what they would have emphasized is that it's really a way to get to know your client. And I think in practice, what's happened is people pass out or say, here's a link to the questionnaire. They fill it out, and then that's almost recorded for, just compliance purposes. It lives in a drawer somewhere, or, in a file system somewhere. But I think what Dick and Danny would have said is this is a way for you to have a conversation. It's a conversation starter to dig in, to get to know the objectives, as you put it, of your client. What are their goals? What are their aspirations? And again, I think they would argue, you need to go well beyond, just a set of questions, and really understand what financially your client wants to accomplish.
In order to accomplish those objectives, you have to invest, because you need to make your money grow to satisfy a lot of consumption. But there's a big trend now in the market that is the private investments, private equity, private debt. And when I was thinking about that teacher that don't know much about the financial markets, one good way you can think that is, okay, we should invest a lot of in private equity, in private debt, because you don't have the volatility that the stock market has. And I think that here in Chile, a lot of financial planners are doing that, but they don't recognize the real risk of that kind of investment plan. What do you think is the role of the private world in an investment solution? Not for the wealthy people, for just for the real people that like the people that really need the help.
Yeah. So I'm probably alone in my view, or maybe I'm not alone, but I guess I am more skeptical that your everyday mom and pop investor are missing out because they're not investing, let's say, in private assets. In as kind of a starting point, right? Private investments are usually, let's say, more complicated, less transparent, less liquid, and in terms of fees, again, which is kind of like a guaranteed thing if you're paying a fee, generally, far more expensive. And in my opinion, one is able to construct, an excellent portfolio without the added need of getting into something that's going to be more complicated, harder to understand, less transparent, less liquid, more expensive. And if I think about an institutional investor with a very long, perhaps even indefinite time frame, it makes sense to me that they would be able to, they don't need the liquidity perhaps as much. They are able to, invest for a very long time. They're able to understand the complexity. And it makes sense to me that an institutional investor would be seeking that. And at the moment, I feel like there's this kind of feeling in that is, that I think perhaps those that have something to sell are trying to sell something, which is, hey, you're missing out if you're not investing in the private investments at the moment. And well, again, when academics study kind of the average return of, say, private equity funds versus public equity funds, the answer is kind of debatable. There's no clear answer that private equity in totality has produced significantly better returns than public equities. And something that I think is not talked about nearly enough is the standard deviation of those investments and distinguishing between what I'll call the asset class and the actual fund that you would invest in. And so, in the United States, kind of the biggest, benchmark that people track is the S&P 500. And there's a large number of, mutual funds and ETFs that are more or less tracking the S&P 500. And if you invest almost in any one of those funds, you can expect to more or less get the expected or the realized return of the S&P 500, less fees, I guess, whatever you paid. And the standard deviation of your investment, the risk of that investment, would be very similar to the S&P 500 itself. In private equity funds, what is frequently happening is people look at the entire universe of all private equity funds and report the average return of those private equity funds, and then some sort of standard deviation of the entire thing. But that is very different than the standard deviation of an individual private equity fund, where the typical private equity fund, you're investing in a relatively concentrated portfolio, and the skill of that private equity manager is extremely important here. Or maybe it's even the luck of that private equity manager is extremely important. They're going to get, if they, hit home runs, so to speak, with a number of their selections, there's going to be a fantastic return. But for offsetting some of the private equity funds with amazing returns are a number of other funds, private equity funds, that had disastrous returns. And the standard deviation of any given individual private equity fund can be quite high, and in many cases, almost all cases, is much higher than that of an individual public equity fund. And again, I think at the moment there's a lot of talk about average returns and not nearly enough talk about kind of the idiosyncratic risk that a private equity investment comes with.
Yeah, you need to study a lot before you go into those private markets.
Yes.
And well, Tom, sadly, the life cycle of this conversation is coming to an end. I want to be mindful of your time. But before we go, we have some maybe rapid fire questions about your experiences, maybe not as related to life cycle finance, but maybe they are. So first, what do you think has been your best investment, most successful one?
Oh man, I'm going to say just kind of, I guess, is investing in my human capital. So I went, to graduate school, went through the CFA program. Kind of investing and learning has, for me, paid the biggest dividends.
And biggest mistake?
Oh,
Financial.
I don't know that I have many regrets. I got lucky investing early on in kind of concentrated individual stocks. And I wouldn't do that today. And I guess I was lucky enough to start there, have them kind of increase in value, and then learn that was maybe I was taking on risk that I didn't need to, and then was able to diversify away from it.
Do you have Bitcoin as a part of your portfolio?
I don't. And again, I guess I don't have to me, like this is a store of value, a currency. Why should a currency kind of go up or down? There is, I guess let's say limited supply, right? And there's, more and more. Do we need more and more fools? I don't know if they're fools. Maybe they're wise. But I do not. But I, of course, a lot of people have, made lots of money, and that, triggers, right, the fear of missing out. Again, from a diversification perspective, I could see how somebody could make, to avoid completely missing out, maybe you do have a sliver in Bitcoin or some sort of other cryptocurrency kind of basket. But no, I don't.
Aside from lifetime financial advice, which we will link in the episode, do you have any resource that you would like to recommend to our audience? Might be a podcast, a video, a movie, a documentary, a book.
Related to finance or just in general?
Maybe it's more interesting if it's not related to finance.
Well, I'm not going to go. I'll stick with finance. So, Mayor Statman, he's at Santa Clara University. He has a book that was published about a year ago, kind of getting into the softer side, the behavioral side of finance, and why you kind of got into objectives. What is it? Why are we really investing? Well, there's some life cycle reasons. There's some we want to sometimes do good with our money. Again, I would encourage people to read. It's an excellent book. I'll throw that out as one, and maybe you could put that in the show notes.
Where can people find you or your thoughts or your research if they want to know more?
I feel like the easiest place has become, LinkedIn, unfortunately. So you can follow me, and I post if we have something new. And I think in my profile, there's links to almost all the stuff that I've written.
That's perfect. Well, thanks everyone for sticking around till the end. Thank you, Thomas, for giving us your time and your knowledge. I hope we have a second part of this conversation in a couple of years when we have the best financial software solution for financial planning in Chile, and Morningstar is afraid that we will take the market. Yeah. But
I like it.
Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks.